Hello and welcome to this Global Thinkers special program on world peace and security. I'm Wang Guan, so good to see all of you here. Since the 18th National Congress of the CPC, the Central Military Commission under Xi Jinping's leadership has taken on the largest military reform in the history of People's Republic of China. 7 military area commands were regrouped into 5 theater commands. Now, 2022 marks the 95th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. How far is China from reaching its stated goal of building a strong army? With heightened geopolitical conflicts, rising tensions between China and the United States, what role will China's military play going forward? I'm very happy to be joined today by leading military strategists and scholars from around the world. Now, joining me in the Beijing studio is Senior Colonel Zhou Bo. He's currently a senior fellow at the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University. We also have with us here Senior Colonel Zhan Gang, Associate Professor of the International College of Defense Studies at National Defense University of China. We also have guests joining us online from New Delhi, India. We have Major General Dipankar Banerjee, former director at Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies. From Dakar, Senegal, we have Brigadier General Hadji Babacar Faye, Chief of Staff at the UN Office of Military Affairs in the Department of Peace Operations. From Washington, D.C., we have Rana Mitter, Professor of the History and Politics of Modern China at Oxford University. Also from Washington, D.C., we have Sourabh Gupta, Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. Welcome, gentlemen. And on top of that, we do have a very distinguished panel of audience joining us from around the world. A lot of young faces over there. Welcome to this roundtable. Now, let me begin with you, Senior Colonel Zhou. There has been this clash of narratives, if you will. China, on one hand, asserts that it is a force for peace. I mean, it's military. But the dominant narrative by far in the West is that the Chinese military is this aggressive, expansionary military. How do you look at this conflict of narratives?
Well, I think it is self-evident if I just tell people to read the fact. The fact is, for over 4 decades, China's rise has been peaceful, and the PLA has never been involved in the war ever since 1979. So this shows China's peaceful rise, which is not seen among major powers in history.
What about these recent military operations across the Taiwan Strait in light of Nancy Pelosi's very controversial visit to the island?
Well, actually, I believe Nancy Pelosi has actually changed the status quo because both China and Washington, both Beijing and Washington point the finger at each other as to who actually has changed the status quo. But I think this time, Nancy Pelosi, in spite of the objection from President Biden or Pentagon, insisting on making such a trip. I believe she just wants to leave some legacy before her retirement. She just wants to have some limelight. But this is purely for her personal gain. So as a result, PLA actually sealed off 6 areas to conduct the unprecedented blockade over Taiwan Island. That shows both our determination to safeguard China's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and our unprecedented new capabilities.
Both the White House in Washington, D.C., and America's new ambassador to China, Nicholas Burns, during an interview with CNN, said China's military were overreacting by asserting those blockades, shelling those bombs in around the Taiwan Strait. How do you look at those American assertions?
Well, if you just say Chinese reaction is overreaction, then tell me what kind of a reaction is appropriate then. So because this is not initiated by us, therefore we are actually making a response. And this kind of provocation to China is unprecedented given the importance of Nancy Pelosi's seat in Americans' leadership. So we warned against such a trip, and President Xi actually had a phone conversation with President Biden. I'm not sure what they talked about, but from the readout, we know definitely Taiwan issue is there. And of course, given the gut feeling of a Chinese, I know how serious this conversation must be. So we give warning beforehand, and we are just taking necessary response. Yes, this kind of exercise is unprecedented, but for this kind of unprecedented provocation, we probably would not be able to have such chance to do this.
Senior Colonel Zhan Gang, let me turn to you. Considering the size, the deployment, and the posture of China's military these days, how would you characterize the role of China's military, the PLA, on the world stage right now?
Pelosi's visit to Taiwan is a political provocation. So this exercise shows China has the capability and to safeguard our territorial integrity and sovereignty.
But how far would China go, would China's military go eventually, given the persistent provocations from the United States?
I think that reminds me of what our defense minister Wei Fenghe has said. If anyone dared to split Taiwan out of China, we will not hesitate to fight. We take any price and we'll fight to the end.
All right. I do want to get some perspectives from outside China. Major General Banerjee, how do you look at the role of China's military these days? What kind of role do you think it has been playing around the world?
The PLA now has emerged in this recent era as the largest military in the world, very sophisticated. In the last 15 years, major restructuring and reorganization has taken place, as a consequence of which the PLA is definitely one of two, perhaps, leading armed force in the world. Its navy is the largest. Its air force has acquired in recent years very sophisticated long-range bomber aircraft, fighter aircraft. It has reorganized its land forces into, as you mentioned, theater commands. It has also re-established its strategic support forces to meet the challenges of the new generation of war that the world is confronting today, and China is well in line to prepare for that. And hence, I would say that whether an army is for peaceful purposes or not is not really on the merit of the army, but depends upon the policy of respective governments. How is that armed force used actually in the international relations, in furtherance of national interests? And of course, I must say, in that context, China's role in recent years have been defensive and has been more in the nature of preparing for war rather than an engagement of hostile operations. But that is how I would like to define this thing. And in that context, I think we welcome China's engaging with the world, new policies that the chairman has laid down. For example, I'm sure we'll discuss on the global security initiatives laid out last year, which laid out a grand policy for the world in realms of defense and security.
All right. Professor Rana Mitter, you wrote a book about China. That name is The Forgotten Ally. If you were to write a book now on the actual role China's military plays versus how it's perceived by Western countries, how would you put it?
Sure. Well, I should just explain that title, Forgotten Ally, refers to the fact that China was the first and most long-lasting ally in the Second World War, of course, in cooperation with the United States and the British Empire after Pearl Harbor in 1941, and the Chinese role essentially in that Second World War experience, fighting against the Axis powers, tends to have been a little forgotten in the outside world. So that's why I used that title. And the context I think we really need to bring to bear, and I'd like to get this into the conversation early on, is something that's very different from the 1930s and 40s when I wrote that, the period about which I wrote that historical book concerning the World War II period. Because today, the world center of economic gravity has moved to the Asia-Pacific region. And China is central to that. But also, China is part of a nexus, a network of economic links, which are underpinned by some quite complex questions of security. So to some extent, I think we can say in the Asia-Pacific region, we are talking about a region where security is basically debated between major powers, between China, the United States with its naval presence, for instance, and also Japan, which we shouldn't forget is also a very major security actor in the region. But beyond that, we have seen in recent years, one of the things that for global stability, global prosperity, global growth is absolutely essential at this post-COVID time, which is the capacity to integrate and have a stable economic environment in the Asia-Pacific. We can see that there are major trade groupings such as the RCEP, the Regional Common Economic Partnership, in which China, along with other Asian actors, is a major player. And there are emergent groups such as CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, in which China has applied for membership and which currently has other major powers, including Japan, and also the United Kingdom, I should say, a country where I am based at the moment. So what's my point? My point here is that actually, if we're going to understand what actually creates a stable, continuous growth in the region, one that's underpinned by the real necessity for the next decade or so, which I would say actually is trying to balance the demands of climate change adaptation with the need for economic growth and bringing people out of poverty, then actually making sure that we concentrate on the economic goods in the region. And China plays an absolutely central role in that, and so do the other partners in the region, including Japan and the Southeast Asian nations.
Yeah, talking about global goods, security is one of them. I want to bring in General Faye over there at the United Nations. General Faye, how do you look at China's role, China's contributions to UN peacekeeping missions?
Thank you very much. China is among the P5 member in United Nations. And when you look at the contribution of China, China is ranked almost the first among the P5 because of its contribution, financial contribution, but also as a TCC, through contributing countries. So, and today, China is almost in more than 5 missions around the world. America decided to cut off its contribution to United Nations funds. It was a huge challenge for us to continue managing the peacekeeping operation. And then China has taken over major contribution in form of extra budget funding. It was great.
Mr. Gupta, how do you look at the contrast between the actual functions of the Chinese military versus the dominant narratives of the Chinese military by people in Washington, D.C., for example?
In 40 years of reform and opening up, less than 150 soldiers have died in anger on China's vast maritime and territorial frontiers. This is an exceptional record. If we can have reform, the new round of reform and opening up go on for 30 more years, imagine what a peaceful place Asia can be and what a dynamic and prosperous place Asia can be. I would like to see a little bit more creativity in China's dispute resolution, territorial dispute resolution, which will also kind of take away some of these accusations with regard to the military. We have to understand, every major leader, I'm talking from Mao down, in the first 10 years of their power in office, they have creatively resolved some territorial disputes or set and train the resolution. This is really the first time since the founding of the People's Republic that we've had no real movement on creative dispute resolution in China's borders. And that is what I think is creating anxiety. And so China has been a peaceful force, a force for peace and stability, but at the same time, it creates anxieties of what its true intentions are down the line. And therefore, I think there's this disjuncture at China's end that it is peaceful and the record shows it's peaceful, and yet many of its neighbors and the West fear its assertiveness and what might come down the line in the future.
Yeah, it is important to keep articulating China's intentions to a Western audience. Senior Colonel Zhou, I want to talk about the issue of Taiwan in light of America's provocations, i.e., Nancy Pelosi's visit to the province of Taiwan. Do you think that is accelerating Beijing's plan to reunify with the island and by force if necessary?
Well, I think Beijing has made it quite clear that we want to have peaceful reunification with the island, provided in three circumstances which are fully laid down in China's anti-secession law. So
three circumstances.
Yes, the first is the Taiwanese Authority declare independence, which I believe would not be possible at all because that would immediately invite China's military response. The second thing is major forces, creating kind of a situation leading to Taiwan separating from mainland China. Well, there is a kind of ambiguity here, but I believe it is actually is referring to foreign forces, aiming at splitting China. But I believe Nancy Pelosi's visit is very much in this category. The third situation is if the mainland China believes that the opportunity for peaceful reunification is exhausted for good, then the mainland has to use force. So provided for these three circumstances, it is, of course, in our best interest for us to achieve peaceful reunification. So coming back to your question, I believe this time is actually a direct warning from mainland China as to what we might be doing should the United States provoke China in such a manner.
It would be naive to think that Joe Biden, as leader of the Democratic Party, has no control whatsoever over the Democratic caucuses in the Congress. But do you think China and America are moving ever closer to war, even if not an all-out war, but minor skirmishes in the waters or in the air?
Well, if you want me to describe my best hope for this China-US relationship, I would just use one word, that is manageable. But the question is how it might be managed. Because you see, as a kind of a follow-up measures, China actually has announced to actually scrap the talks between the military, to stop the consultation, so on and so forth. Well, this actually might just seem harsh toward some observers, but this also indicates that the Taiwan issues is really China's core interest. And for this core interest, China could actually make all necessary sacrifices.
Senior Colonel Zhan, let me turn to you and asking you the same question. Do you think Washington and Beijing are inching ever closer to war, no matter how reluctant or begrudging Beijing is, given Washington's provocations?
If you look back to history, when a war is breaking out, sometimes it's because of the frictions on the front lines. In other situations, it broke out because of the political provocations. And I think the Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan is a political provocation. It just proves that she's an irresponsible, not serious politician.
Obviously, Washington is promising one thing on one hand, through the three communiques, and doing another by sending one of their most senior officials to, a province of China that it acknowledges as a province, as a part of China, although it chose to use a very, ambivalent word of acknowledging. Let me turn to you, Major General Banerjee. How do you look at Washington's postures in Asia Pacific? If you think about the Quad, the AUKUS, the Five Eyes Alliance, and also most recently IPAF, which also has a geopolitical flavor at countering or at least hedging against China. Are Washington's moves making China this aggressive power a self-fulfilling prophecy?
I think today we are undergoing globally very challenging times. The global geopolitical environment is undergoing dramatic changes. Geostrategically, the weapons of war are being upgraded and their destructive potential is being highlighted even more. And currently, the possibility of their being used in the Ukraine situation and the similar armaments in the Indo-Pacific that are being currently built up. The trend towards nuclearization that one is seeing, both in Europe as well as in the Indo-Pacific, is a cause for serious concern. And therefore, all our energies and efforts must be directed towards ensuring that conflict situations are diffused, these are addressed in a non-confrontational, non-war-like manner, and hence methods and procedures to further that must be a very important part of our focus today. And in that context, I would like to once again mention Global Security Initiative requires to be addressed. But I'm sure we'll be coming to that later. But in that context, let me also say that China's role in the United Nations peacekeeping operations in the last 20 years, 30 years, has been very dramatic and significant. Actually, I was present in Beijing in 1990 when this was discussed at a very high level in the PLA and with international support, and I was one of the persons present in that. And since then, in the last 30 years, as we know, China has contributed some 50,000 soldiers, by far the largest of the permanent members of the Security Council, and also in terms of financial support. And so, hence, I think we have to today look at these emerging problems, like the one that is going on in Ukraine now, potential conflicts in the Indo-Pacific, including the one in the northeastern Pacific Ocean, in Taiwan and other islands of the region, and in the South China Sea, in a very different perspective. How to prevent conflicts breaking out, not just who's right, who's wrong, and who has the right to attack or not. This is a challenge that confronts the entire global strategic community today.
I want to bring in Professor Rana Mitter again. Professor Mitter, to what extent do you think the West is misunderstanding and perhaps even distorting the intentions and objectives of China's military?
Oh, I think both sides are failing to understand each other. I think there's one particular element that has been very important in previous decades that is missing now, and which I can sum up in one word that we need to bring back. And that word is dialogue. I think that one of the things that is most urgent is the ramping up of extensive and multi-layered dialogue between key actors in major countries. And we keep talking about US and China. I point out that as someone who's based in the United Kingdom, we may not have so much of a direct link with China all the time, but of course, there are many other countries around the world that also have a real interest in this wider discussion. The questions of lowering the tension, talking about the creativity that was mentioned, I think, by Dr. Gupta, and the new sort of thinking that enables people to think outside the box, that I think has been implied in everything that all of our speakers have said. I'll be honest with you, that can't come even through a video. We're talking on video screen at the moment, and that's great for having some sort of discussion. But I think in terms of getting people into a room who have had long experience of working with each other and understanding how to bring down the tensions, that's important for the Chinese side. It's important for the American side. It's important for other actors in Asia and elsewhere. It needs to expand much more, and there needs to be much more talking in quiet rooms behind the scenes where there are no cameras and nobody recording what's going on. We all know that looking at history, that's where the really important decisions during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States were actually calmed down. Not when the cameras were on in the official rooms with people putting forward their talking points in the same way that they always do, but actually having a serious discussion with nuance, subtlety, and creativity. That's what we need right now.
Mr. Sourabh Gupta, Rana talked about a very important issue of having meaningful and substantive dialogue, sometimes even in the form of private conversations behind closed doors when cameras were shut. But do you think that window of opportunity for meaningful dialogues between Washington and Beijing are closing these days, given the politicization of issues, given domestic politics on both sides, and given other factors such as path dependence?
I wouldn't necessarily say they are closing, but let me say this from the Chinese perspective. It would much prefer that the Democrats and President Biden, who President Xi has had a long interaction with for many years, They are far more preferred than a Republican administration. I have already seen in this administration both sides trying to lay a floor beneath which the relationship will not sink. While during the last few years of the Trump administration, there was no limit to which the relationship could sink. Yes, both sides have an incentive to talk. I think both sides are much better off talking. I wouldn't have very high expectations for talk right now, simply because everybody is going into a very heightened political season right now. We have the midterms coming up, but more importantly, it's the 20th Party Congress. And so at this point of time, I would say diplomacy becomes that much more important just to maintain that connection between the two sides. But I would not be too pessimistic about the two sides talking. I think 2023 will see both sides see each other in a renewed vision and really ratchet up engagement, including, and I would think this would be across the board. It'll be in the area of military, it'll be climate, it'll be economics. The impression will be created that the two sides are standoffish and don't want to talk, when the fact of the matter is they really don't have their interlocutors ready to talk because of politics.
Let's see when the leaders of both capitals will be able to meet face to face. General Faye, I want to bring you back again. You know, many interpret China's military operations overseas as so-called evidence of China getting, increasingly assertive. For example, its military base in Djibouti, it's sending military patrols off the Gulf of Aden. How do you look at that?
China have many challenges. Look at the border. China is bordered by 13 countries, in plus Japan, Korea, and then. If you look at the French on the east, you see that there are a lot of islands that are here. And then they need to be, and then all this is bordering a line of navigation that is very important for the trade. So if China have no control on this route of navigation, so it may suffocate one day for its economy. This is one challenge. The second one is you see the interest of other countries like United States to have a control on the sea, even on the route of navigation. If you go off the Gulf of Aden, look at all the oil and the energy and transiting from this area. So it's very important for China to be present if it wants to stand as a superpower. And it is something that a reactive stand that is necessary to keep yourself alive. There is a huge competition between China and United States. You know, they have worked on the AUKUS, is one of them. When United States is launching AUKUS to make sure that they empower Australia to make sure that have submarines, conventionally propelled ammunition, it means that we can launch an attack from this area, what is needed for a short launch or something like that. We go over there and then you go on the Gulf of Aden. It's economic. If you cannot stay on the economic, you cannot stand. So all this military buildup is to make sure that the country be able to pursue the interests of the country and then to make sure that to stand for the interests of the country. So this is something, a natural stand-up, and that it is viewed as a normal stand for China to keep its place in Asia, in the Southeast, and in the world. Because so a lot of countries, even in Africa, are looking at China as a standing balance for the world order. So this is something that it's very important that it keep.
Yeah, you know, Senior Colonel Zhou, most recently President Xi Jinping at the opening ceremony of Boao Forum proposed this global security initiative. How significant is that?
I think it is very significant in that if you read into the foreign policy of President Xi Jinping, you would find on top of this idea is what he called community of shared future. Then underneath there are two umbrellas. One is for global development, another is for global security. In terms of global development, we already have something, for example, like a Belt and Road Initiative. And then in terms of global security, what impressed me most is his idea about how security should be indivisible. How it should be effective and sustainable. And this idea only came into being after the Russo-Ukrainian war, because the rest of his ideas basically would echo China's position, and even some that are just promoted within the United Nations, like sovereignty. These are just the golden, principles enshrined in international law. But he also talked about the importance of addressing non-traditional threats. And just like all those gentlemen have talked about, for example, China's counterparty operation in the Gulf of Aden, for which I have been a coordinator for about 6 years, so I know almost every details about this operation. And that is a good example, almost a golden example of how PLA, how the best PLA would look like. Why? Because every armed forces would take territorial integrity or defense authority as top priority. But for major powers, there are two things more. One is your interest overseas. And for China, China's overseas interest is ubiquitous, right? And then the great obligations of a major power. And counterparty best reflect how China actually have been blending all these two, because it is not only escorting Chinese ships, but also foreign ships. And it's just a half and half. This shows how PLA could look like in its best in the future.
Yeah, because some are saying that China is sending its troops to the United Nations peacekeeping forces to, exert or expand its own influence. How do you look at that, Senior Colonel Zhan?
You said that China is sent more peacekeeping troops to expand its influence. I would like to say that it's a positive influence. I will encourage those countries who have hundreds of thousands of troops deployed in overseas to send their troops to peacekeeping operations under the UN flag. That will make a big contribution to the world. I think that's an expansion of influence welcomed by countries all around the world.
And then how do you look at President Xi Jinping's global security initiative?
I think China can make a contribution to the peace of the world by a lot of different ways. One of the ways is to provide more public security goods. As we just mentioned, we can send more peacekeeping troops to the region. We, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, we can support equality and justice based on the rules of international laws, especially the UN Charter. On the other side, we can also make a contribution to world peace by providing some Chinese solutions to global challenges, such as the Global Security Initiative is put forward by China to benefit the world. It's different from the Western theory of geopolitical competition. It's from a point of building a community of shared future for the mankind. I think that will have a great benefit for the world.
All right, I want to now open it up for questions from our members of audience who are joining us at this round table. I do know that they have some comments and questions. Feel free to engage in our conversation. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Okay, the young lady on in the second row, please.
Hello, everyone. So glad to be here. And my question is, how should China and the United States manage the potential crises or conflicts?
General Banerjee.
And thank you so much for asking this particular question. Today I think we are in a changing world and a deeply disturbing world. Even since day before yesterday, there are major changes that have taken place globally, which threatens the stability and the survival of this planet. President Zelensky changed his war aim to a certain extent, I would say, by saying that the goal for Ukraine is now no longer peace and settlement of the dispute, but victory. The current developments in the last few weeks in the Indo-Pacific has now brought to the fore the possibilities of an enlargement of the global conflict in this particular environment close to our cities and countries. Capturing large island nations are not as simple as it was in the Second World War when the Allied forces launched the attack in the Normandy coast and then went up the European continent and defeated Germany. Today's weapons systems now allow those independent beachheads where troops have to land by boat and by ship and then proceed the operations. Those beaches can be engaged effectively by precision-guided weapons from hundreds of kilometers away, and those beaches can be destroyed. Therefore, in today's world, there is no victory in warfare. That era has ended. We are aware of the fragility of the planet, of the ecological disasters taking place in many parts of the world, and also the weakness of our economical and social structures that can lead to so many other conflicts. So in that context, the only way out of these difficult, challenging circumstances is through greater dialogue, discussion, addressing each other's issues, addressing them constructively, and through a process of peacemaking and peace building through the United Nations systems to try and address these problems. The time is short. I'm afraid, we just have a little while to go. Whether in months or years, I would not like to alarm people, but that is a time frame that we have.
Thank you so much, Major General Banerjee. Thank you for the answer. All right, any more questions? All right, we have that gentleman in the left top corner. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much for all of your presentations. We've talked about the Nancy Pelosi provocations in Taiwan, and also Dr. Mitter has also talked about kind of our potentials in environmental partnerships, among many others that must be furthered. I know one of the responses that China has issued in terms of diplomatically towards kind of the provocations was to pause partnerships on the environmental front. And my question would be, would worsen bilateral relations delay climate goals? And are there more creative solutions around this, as one of the other panelists has spoken about?
Very good. Rana.
Sure. So I'm going to put my cards very clearly on the table on this. I mean, we were talking about security and global security, and it's a really important issue. I think we are all coming to realize that how large an army you have, even to some extent how large an economy you have, doesn't matter at all if global cross-border climate change essentially changes the terms of the game for everyone. And our questioner put exactly the right word into his question, the word creative. It seems to me, and I think most who observe the question of where we are right now in the world, that the major powers, in other words, the major creators of climate change, United States, China, India, European Union, need to make sure that this particular dialogue continues and deepens aside from any other issues that may be on the agenda. We all know that it's not always easy to separate issues of security, issues of culture, issues of national boundaries or whatever. But the problem is that climate change doesn't care about that. It doesn't care about whether or not a particular border area is secured or whether or not a particular conference on weaponry is put forward or not. It's just going to keep happening as it is right now. And I think the plus side, and I think as we're coming near to the end of the program, we should end with a positive. If we can get our key players in Beijing, in New Delhi, in Washington, in Brussels and elsewhere to actually sit in a much more speeded up, much more frequently held climate change conversation, that will also force people into that kind of dialogue and that kind of behind the scenes talking on an issue that's crucial to all of us. But it also makes us realize that actually spending time talking about where we're different instead of trying to understand where we actually have areas of immense common interest, not only could save the planet in terms of rapidly changing drought, climate change, and desertification, but also more broadly help smooth the way for what we all know we're going to have, which is a peaceful world in which we acknowledge each other's differences, acknowledge that we're not going to agree on everything, but acknowledge that also essentially ending up in either a war or a climate change disaster is a gross betrayal of the next generations to come. And I think none of us would want that on our conscience.
Thanks so much, Rana, and thank you, Michael, for that question. We do have time for one last question. Anyone? All right, that lady.
Hi, everyone. And my question is, how should we rightly assess each other's military development and international military development? And the question goes for Senior Colonel Mr. Zhou Bo.
Okay, Senior Colonel.
Well, I think basically military capabilities of different countries are at the cost of other militaries. So therefore, what I can say is that China's peaceful rise demonstrates that the Chinese military is at least exceptional, if not unique, in making China's development peaceful and tranquil. The challenge ahead really is for China and the United States, how we two countries could coexist. And that invites the question of whether China and the United States would actually come into conflict. I don't believe at all that Chinese and American militaries would have an accidental war in the Strait of Taiwan. Because in the South China Sea, we may just meet each other unplanned. And if we do not keep safe distance, well, maybe we could have an accident. But in the Strait of Taiwan, nothing is accidental. And this is China's territory, and the U.S. apparently is an outsider. So I believe the United States really should search its soul to answer this question. To what extent is this island fundamentally vital to the core interest of the United States?
Yeah, sometimes you want your military to be so strong that you do not have to use it. It is called deterrence. I want to thank all of our panelists and our audience for this fascinating discussion. And thank you, our dear audience from around the world, for tuning in for this Global Thinkers special on world peace and security. I want to thank all of you here. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Bye and take care.